Darkness settles slowly over a divided world. It is the kind of darkness that does not announce itself with thunder or armies, but with quiet hands working behind locked doors, with names erased from documents, with decisions made by people who will never be remembered, yet whose choices shaped the fate of millions. History likes to pretend it is written by leaders standing under bright lights, but the truth is far heavier. The greatest shifts of power often begin where no one is watching, behind a single unmarked door, in a windowless room, in a whispered conversation that will never be recorded. And when those shadows grow long enough, they no longer merely influence nations, they begin to rewrite them. Some say the world changed because people demanded it. Others believe it changed because technology advanced or empires fell. But beneath each explanation lies a hidden pulse, a force that pushed events forward with relentless precision. That force belonged to a network of minds trained to operate in silence, to intervene where diplomacy failed, to alter outcomes without leaving fingerprints. They were neither soldiers nor politicians. They lived in the gray space between legality and necessity. They belonged to an institution that understood one truth better than any other. Power is not what is declared, but what is controlled. And once a system learns to manipulate the unseen, it begins to see every crisis not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Every continent becomes a chessboard. Every rebellion, a tool. Every unknown faction, a piece to be moved. The world you think you recognize, the alliances, the conflicts, the governments that rise and fall, rests on a foundation far more engineered than anyone dares to admit. Because in the shadows, the rules are different. In the shadows, outcomes can be designed. And the cost of that design is always paid by someone who never agreed to the price. They say every modern institution has an origin story, but some origins are so deeply buried beneath layers of secrecy that they resemble myths more than history. To understand the silent machinery that would one day become America's most formidable intelligence apparatus, we must step far outside the borders of the United States, far beyond the 20th century, into the dim and ancient roots of espionage itself. Because long before satellites watched from the cold edges of orbit, long before encrypted networks pulsed through the nerves of nations, long before one agency in Langley learned how to bend global events toward its will, humanity had already discovered the power of information gathered in silence. It began in the first cities, those fragile clusters of stone and worship rising from desert plains and river valleys, in places where kings ruled by divine claim, yet feared every whisper in the marketplace. In the courts of early Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded not only trade and tribute, but coded reports describing enemy alliances, troop movements, intentions gleaned from merchants, drifting between cities like living strands of intelligence. The rulers of Sumer and Akkad understood something essential. War was not won by strength alone, but by anticipation. And anticipation required knowledge that no rival wanted you to possess. Across the Nile, ancient Egypt refined secrecy into ritual. Pharaohs relied on priests and scribes, whose loyalty was enforced through both sacred duty and silent threat. They carried messages in symbolic language that could mislead outsiders, embedding truth within layers of metaphor. These early intelligence channels operated in shadows cast by pyramids and sun temples, vast structures proclaiming eternal power, while the real work of preserving that power occurred out of sight. Their purpose was simple: ensure the ruler knew more than his enemies, and preferably before the enemies knew themselves. In the distant East, another lineage of clandestine craft emerged. The realms that would later form China developed a philosophy of information warfare, so deep and intricate that its principles still study the modern battlefield. Texts attributed to Sun Tzu described spies not as immoral tools, but as unavoidable necessities, extensions of strategy itself. To fight without understanding your opponent was considered a failure of intellect. To win without revealing your hand was considered the highest mastery. Empires that expanded across mountains, plains, and river deltas relied on the networks of informants, scouts disguised as traders, servants who overheard council meetings, wanderers carrying fabricated rumors designed to nudge rivals into self-destruction. These ancient systems had no satellites, no wiretaps, no global communications grid, yet they achieved something extraordinary. They proved secrecy could function as a weapon. They demonstrated that hidden action could alter visible history, and they laid the groundwork for a truth that would echo across millennia, that nations rise not only through conquest, but through the invisible architecture of intelligence. As centuries passed, new civilizations emerged and layered their own innovations onto the architecture. The Persian Empire built one of the world's first large-scale intelligence networks, stretching across royal roads that connected distant territories like binans carrying political oxygen. Their king's eyes and ears roamed the empire disguised as ordinary citizens, collecting whispers from taverns, markets, caravan posts, ensuring that rebellion could be predicted and loyalty measured with chilling precision. The Greeks refined the concept further. City-states like Athens and Sparta, forever entangled in rivalry, embraced espionage as a civic necessity. Sparta trained its youth in the arts of stealth and silent observation. Athens used diplomats and merchants as conduits of subtle manipulation. Even their myths reflected the tension between appearance and truth. Heroes known not only for strength, but for cunning. In their world, as in ours, information was power, and secrecy was the silent twin of strategy. By the time Rome ascended, espionage was no longer merely a supplement to governance. It was embedded within the empire's bones. The Roman frumentarii, originally grain merchants, evolved into one of history's earliest organized intelligence corps. They monitored provincial governors, tracked dissent, and sometimes eliminated threats under orders that would never be recorded. They were both servants of the state and shadows within it, operating in the spaces where law blurred into necessity. And through medieval centuries, through the courts of Venice with its secret councils, through the Byzantine labyrinth of double agents and coded correspondence, through the Mongol networks that stretched from Central Asia to the edge of Europe, the principle remained the same. Rulers survive not because they are strongest, but because they know enough. When European empires expanded across oceans, they built intelligence systems to match their ambitions. Colonial administrators mapped tribal loyalties, infiltrated resistance movements, and used knowledge as leverage over entire populations. Secrecy became a bureaucratic language. Information became a commodity that shaped policies continents away. And the idea of controlling foreign territories through indirect influence, pulling strings while avoiding open war, began to crystallize into a method that would define the modern age. It is inside this enormous ancient lineage, this unbroken chain of hidden watchers and silent manipulators, that the roots of America's intelligence apparatus must be placed. Long before the CIA existed, the philosophy that would define its global reach had already been perfected. Power exercised without acknowledgement, influence exerted without visibility, intervention carried out without admission. The agency did not invent the shadow. It merely stepped into it, inheriting techniques shaped by thousands of years of human fear, ambition, and cunning. But every inheritance carries a cost, and as the modern world hurtled toward the most devastating conflict it had ever seen, that cost would soon become impossible to ignore. The 20th century did not merely accelerate history. It shattered it, reassembled it, and demanded new tools for a world rapidly shedding its old certainties. The United States, once distant from the rivalries of Europe and the empires of Asia, suddenly found itself drawn into a global storm. But before it could understand the magnitude of the forces about to reshape the planet, it needed something it had never possessed: a permanent, organized, and far-reaching mechanism for gathering the truth hidden behind enemy lines. During the First World War, the U.S. had experimented with intelligence, but only in temporary forms, improvised units, scattered missions, overlapping jurisdictions. It was a country still naive about the depth of deception that older empires had long since mastered. Yet even then, seeds were planted. Codebreakers worked in cramped rooms, deciphering telegrams that revealed political intentions. Naval intelligence officers tracked foreign ships with growing sophistication, and a small number of American diplomats discovered that the world they moved through was not governed solely by treaties, but by secrets exchanged in corridors and back rooms. Still, when the war ended, the U.S. retreated from the shadows. It dismantled most of its intelligence capacities, assuming the world had returned to order. It had not understood that the nature of conflict was evolving, that power was becoming less about visible armies and more about clandestine influence. Europe understood, Japan understood, the Soviet Union understood. America would learn, but not until the world erupted again. When the Second World War engulfed continents, the U.S. finally realized it could no longer remain blind. A rapidly mechanizing, ideologically divided world demanded something more sophisticated than traditional military reconnaissance. It needed a centralized apparatus capable of navigating deception on an industrial scale. And so, in the tense early years of the war, a new institution emerged, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. The OSS was not polished. It was not universally respected. To many inside the military hierarchy, it seemed reckless, an organization run by intellectuals, adventurers, and visionaries who refused to think within conventional boundaries. But it possessed something priceless: imagination. Under the leadership of William Wild Bill Donovan, the OSS blended academic expertise, psychological insight, guerrilla tactics, espionage training, and propaganda strategies into a single organism. It operated behind enemy lines, armed resistance movements in occupied territories, forged documents, analyzed foreign economies, recorded hidden atrocities, and pieced together fragments of information into coherent pictures that military planners desperately needed. For the first time, the U.S. developed a taste for covert influence. Agents learned to manipulate events without exposing American fingerprints. They learned to disrupt supply lines, sabotage infrastructure, and build networks of informants across Europe and Asia. They learned to shape narratives, not just battles. The OSS proved that intelligence was not merely data collection, it was an art of altering reality. Yet even as the OSS became indispensable, it attracted enemies at home. Many feared the creation of a secretive institution capable of operating outside traditional oversight. Others believed that once the war ended, such an organization would become unnecessary or even dangerous. So, when victory finally arrived, the OSS was dissolved. Its pieces were scattered across the bureaucracy, its veterans left in uncertain positions, its legacy seemingly cut short. But history rarely erases what works. And by the time the war ended, a new adversary had already emerged, a force that convinced American policymakers that the shadows could not be abandoned. The Soviet Union, victorious but wary, began consolidating an enormous sphere of influence. Their intelligence services, long established and ruthlessly effective, expanded operations across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Their ideology spread through newly decolonized nations. Their political pressures reshaped alliances. To American leaders, this was not merely geopolitical rivalry, it was an existential struggle. A divided world required a unified vision, a new kind of warfare, covert, ideological, psychological, required a new institution. And in 1947, the United States made a decision that would define its global posture for generations. It created an agency empowered not simply to gather information, but to influence events far beyond its borders. It allowed secrecy to become a tool of national policy. It opened the door to interventions that could never be acknowledged publicly. The CIA was born not from stability, but from fear. Not from clarity, but from uncertainty. Not from a desire to expand power, but from a desperation to preserve it. And yet, once an institution learns that the shadows offer opportunities unavailable in the light, it begins to see the world through different eyes. The Cold War did not merely justify the existence of the CIA, it shaped its identity, sharpened its ambitions, and gave it a mission so broad that even its architects could not foresee where it would lead. From the ruins of global conflict, a new empire of secrecy was forming, and its reach would soon extend into corners of the world untouched by traditional diplomacy, weaving influence through governments, movements, economies, and revolutions. But before the agency could expand outward, it had to define its internal philosophy, its moral framework, or lack thereof, and determine how far it was willing to go in the pursuit of security. Those decisions, made in offices shielded from public view, would change the trajectory of nations. In the uneasy stillness that followed World War II, the world tried to rebuild itself from ruins, but beneath the visible reconstruction, a new map of influence was already forming, one drawn not by borders, but by ideological gravity. Two global powers, armed with opposite visions of humanity's future, began pulling nations into their orbit. And in this emerging contest, the CIA discovered a revelation. Influence spread not only through alliances or threats, but through culture, identity, aspiration, and fear. To shape the world, one did not always need armies. Sometimes, one only needed access to minds, to movements, to the fragile hopes inside nations uncertain of their path. The agency's earliest years were defined by experimentation. Europe, still scarred and starving, became a laboratory for clandestine influence. The CIA funneled money into political parties aligned with Western interests, afraid that economic despair would drive voters toward communism. It supported labor unions in some nations and undermined them in others. It sponsored intellectual circles, newspapers, film studios, and radio broadcasts, weaving pro-American narratives into the cultural fabric. These operations were subtle, almost invisible, but devastatingly effective. They shaped public opinion without revealing the hands that guided it. Across Italy and France, the agency worked to fracture leftist coalitions by empowering rival voices dismissed as marginal only years earlier. In Greece, it supported anti-communist forces amid civil war, interpreting the struggle not as a local conflict, but as a symptom of a global ideological illness. In West Germany, the agency assisted in reconstructing intelligence services that had been dismantled after the fall of the Third Reich, an act that carried its own shadows, its own uneasy compromises with Europe's grim recent past. But the influence did not stop at political structures. The CIA learned that shaping a nation's cultural identity could shift the trajectory of its future. Funding poured into artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly connected to American intelligence. Cultural diplomacy was reframed not as a bland exchange of goodwill, but as a strategic weapon in the battle for global perception. Jazz musicians toured Eastern Europe as unofficial ambassadors of freedom. Abstract expressionist art, once considered subversive, was promoted abroad as a symbol of creativity unrestrained by authoritarian dictates. Even academic conferences and literary journals became vessels for ideological influence. The strategy expanded eastward. In Iran, where oil wealth attracted Western interests, the agency monitored political currents closely. In Southeast Asia, where colonial empires crumbled and independence movements surged, American operatives mapped local factions, tribal alliances, and ideological networks with increasing sophistication. In the Philippines and Indonesia, the agency navigated a labyrinth of nationalism, economic upheaval, and anti-colonial fervor, identifying which leaders might steer their countries toward Washington and which might drift toward Moscow or Beijing. But cultural expansion was not a one-directional effort. The CIA had to understand cultures at a profound level: religions, ethnic identities, historical grievances, class divisions, because influence only worked when it aligned with the emotional structure of a society. In Latin America, the agency confronted the legacy of colonial inequality, where oligarchies ruled over populations longing for land, dignity, and reform. In the Middle East, it encountered the deep currents of anti-imperialist resentment, the memory of foreign powers carving territories with little regard for the people living there. In Africa, it entered a continent awakening from centuries of extraction, where independence movements brimmed with hope but were vulnerable to Cold War pressures. Everywhere it went, the agency learned the same lesson. The most powerful interventions were not those forced upon people, but those that felt like self-made choices. Influence became a form of guided evolution, shaping societies from within. But to guide a society, one had to understand its myths, fears, aspirations, and fractures. The CIA recruited anthropologists, economists, linguists, historians, people trained not in warfare, but in human complexity. They studied how rumors spread in rural villages, how political identity formed in urban centers, how religious leaders shaped public sentiment. Information became not just facts, but patterns that could be nudged, redirected, leveraged. As the Cold War expanded its reach, the agency's systems grew more intricate. It established listening stations across continents, cultivated informants in ministries and militaries, intercepted communications, built alliances with local elites, and monitored dissident movements. It learned to anticipate elections before ballots were cast, to predict coups before tanks rolled, to assess revolutions before slogans appeared on walls. And with each success, confidence grew. Perhaps global events could truly be managed from afar. But beneath this confidence lay a growing unease. Influence, once considered a temporary necessity, had begun to crystallize into a doctrine, one that justified meddling not only to counter Soviet expansion, but to preserve American interests broadly defined. The line between defense and ambition blurred. The question was no longer simply how to protect the world from authoritarianism, but how to ensure the world aligned with American geopolitical strategy. This shift carried consequences no one fully anticipated. Because the more deeply an institution embeds itself in the political DNA of foreign nations, the harder it becomes to understand where necessity ends and empire begins. And the more one reshapes the world, the more the world changes the shaper. By the mid-century, the CIA had become something unprecedented, an institution not merely reacting to global tides, but actively steering them. It moved through governments, economies, and social movements with increasing ease. And as the map of influence expanded, its operations grew bolder, riskier, and far heavier in consequence. For the Shadow Network had reached a point of no return. The next chapters of its history would not be defined by subtle cultural influence, but by direct confrontation, covert battles that would ignite conflicts, topple governments, empower hidden factions, and leave marks on the world that would last generations. The era of quiet expansion was ending. Something far darker was beginning. The quiet contests of influence that once defined the early Cold War soon proved inadequate for a world spiraling into upheaval. Across continents, movements surged with new energy. Independence struggles, revolutions, ideological awakenings, and social fractures that no foreign power fully understood. And in that turbulence, the CIA saw both danger and opportunity. The subtle work of shaping culture and nudging political tendencies was no longer enough. The agency began to view global events through a sharper, more urgent lens. If the United States did not intervene decisively, the Soviets would. And if the Soviets prevailed, entire regions might fall under authoritarian rule. This belief, half fear, half prophecy, became the emotional engine driving a new phase of expansion. It started in places where existing power structures were fragile, where leaders struggled to navigate competing visions of the future. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes tightened their grip, leaving Washington convinced that a counterbalance was needed elsewhere. In Asia, communist revolutions and anti-colonial movements collided in unpredictable ways. In Latin America, long-standing inequalities created fertile ground for radical politics. Each region contained a unique blend of history, culture, and tension. Yet from the perspective of policymakers in Washington, these differences blurred into one overarching narrative. The world was on the brink of ideological realignment, and the United States had to act swiftly. Iran became one of the earliest and most defining battlegrounds of this emerging doctrine. The struggle there was not simply political, it was symbolic, a test of how far covert action could reshape a nation's trajectory. But it also sent a message to the agency itself. Covert intervention could be decisive. It could protect strategic interests without committing troops. It could change the direction of history with a handful of operatives, a network of local allies, and a carefully orchestrated narrative. This realization, this intoxicating sense of precision and power, carried enormous consequences. It defined the agency's confidence for decades to come. From the Middle East, attention shifted to Southeast Asia, where the retreat of European empires left a vacuum filled by competing ideologies. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, names that would later ignite global protest, were in the 1950s and early 1960s arenas of intense covert observation. The CIA trained local operatives, funded political factions, and monitored every shift in rural villages and urban capitals. Agents moved through jungles and rice fields, gathering intelligence on guerrilla movements that had grown sharper with each year of conflict. They reported not only battles and borders, but psychological currents, how fear shaped allegiance, how propaganda spread, how loyalty could be bought, manipulated, or broken. In Indonesia, one of the world's largest archipelagos and home to a rising nationalist identity, the agency faced a complex mosaic of ethnic groups, political parties, and religious influences. The stakes were high. The potential alignment of such a large nation with the Soviet bloc or China was viewed as a geopolitical earthquake, and so, using a mix of propaganda, economic pressure, and support for certain military figures, the agency sought to tilt the balance. The results would reverberate through the region, reshaping Indonesia's internal landscape in ways the world would continue to grapple with for decades. Latin America became another vast theater of covert engagement. Here, the ideological battle intertwined with centuries of inequality and entrenched power structures. Reformist movements emerged promising land redistribution, literacy campaigns, and social transformation. To the CIA, these movements appeared dangerously close to socialist alignment. In Guatemala, in Chile, in Brazil, and across the continent, the agency monitored the fragile relationship between democracy, reform, and elite interests. Central America, with its history of foreign corporate investment and deep political fractures, became especially vulnerable to external manipulation. The agency believed it was preventing Soviet influence from gaining footholds, but on the ground, lives were shattered, governments overturned, and societies thrown into cycles of conflict. Africa, too, entered the CIA's expanding field of vision. As nations won independence from European rule, they faced the monumental task of building new identities. Political parties formed around ethnic lines, religious traditions, or visions of modernization. Leaders emerged, some charismatic, some authoritarian, some genuinely attempting to uplift their people. But newly independent governments were fragile, and the Cold War turned their vulnerability into battlegrounds of influence. The agency cultivated alliances with leaders perceived as pro-Western, supported anti-communist factions, and sought to prevent rival powers from gaining strategic access to the continent's vast resources. But Africa's internal realities, colonial wounds, tribal divisions, economic instability, were more complicated than any covert operation could fully navigate. Through all these interventions, one pattern emerged. The CIA was no longer merely observing history, it was orchestrating it. Each strategic success reinforced the belief that the agency could manage global events with precision. Each operation, whether acknowledged or kept secret, added another layer to the idea that covert influence was not just necessary, but effective. And yet, each intervention also introduced new complexities, unforeseen consequences that would not fully reveal themselves until years, sometimes decades, later. The world was changing, and the CIA had become a silent gravitational force within that change. But momentum carries its own danger. Expansion creates expectations, and expectations give rise to actions that push beyond caution, beyond calculation. The next phase would test the agency's limits, politically, morally, and strategically. It would confront adversaries far more sophisticated, internal dissent far more determined, and global crises far more explosive than anything encountered before. The shadow network had expanded across continents. Now it would be thrust into conflict. The momentum that had carried the agency across continents now confronted a world entering a sharper, more volatile phase of the Cold War. Influence alone was no longer enough. The stakes had escalated. Ideologies clashed with greater ferocity. Decolonization reshaped political landscapes, and technological advances compressed the timeline of global events. The CIA found itself pulled into crises with accelerating speed, its role shifting from shaper of outcomes to guardian against what policymakers feared could be catastrophic geopolitical collapse. Yet beneath this official rationale, another truth took root. The agency had become essential to American strategy, not because it solved problems, but because its very existence encouraged a belief that all problems could be solved through covert design. Nowhere was this more evident than in the escalating tensions surrounding Cuba. When Fidel Castro's revolution succeeded, it caught Washington entirely off guard. Analysts had underestimated the depth of resentment toward the Batista regime, the appeal of Castro's promises, and the ideological flexibility of a movement that initially contained more nationalism than socialism. But once Castro aligned himself with Moscow, alarm transformed into urgency. The CIA moved quickly, training exiles, planning covert incursions, and attempting to shape Cuban politics before the island solidified its identity as a Soviet ally. The Bay of Pigs operation, conceived as a precise intervention that would spark internal rebellion, instead collapsed into a humiliating failure. It revealed a dangerous flaw. Confidence in covert action could blind decision-makers to cultural and political realities on the ground. Yet the failure produced not humility, but escalation. The U.S. doubled down on efforts to weaken Castro. Sabotage missions, propaganda campaigns, and plots intended to destabilize the Cuban government proliferated. In the shadows, the agency experimented with tactics that blurred the line between national security and political obsession. And as the world careened toward the Cuban Missile Crisis, the consequences of miscalculation became stark. The CIA's intelligence gathering proved invaluable in identifying Soviet installations, but the crisis also demonstrated how close the world had come to catastrophe in a conflict partially shaped by competing covert maneuvers. The agency emerged from the episode convinced that vigilance in the shadows had prevented global disaster, but critics argued the opposite, that clandestine brinkmanship had helped build the conditions for crisis in the first place. ASEA soon became the largest canvas of U.S. intervention. Vietnam, a country divided by ideology, history, and foreign ambition, drew the CIA deeper into unconventional warfare. The agency trained local militias, facilitated psychological operations, and attempted to predict rural loyalties in villages fragmented by decades of conflict. It gathered intelligence on guerrilla networks, mapped supply routes cutting through jungles and mountains, and supported programs aimed at achieving hearts and minds victory. But the effort was undermined by a fundamental misunderstanding. Nationalism, not communism, drove much of the Vietnamese struggle. Attempts to manipulate political evolution collided with local realities. And as the war escalated from covert engagement to full-scale military conflict, the agency found itself navigating a landscape where success could not be measured by intelligence reports or strategic models. In Laos and Cambodia, covert action expanded even more dramatically. Secret airstrips, proxy armies, and paramilitary operations created layers of conflict invisible to much of the world. Intelligence officers worked with local tribal groups caught between superpowers, promising protection, autonomy, and support, promises that could not always be kept. Here, secrecy became a double-edged sword. It allowed operations to continue without political oversight, but it also shielded the long-term consequences from public view. When these consequences finally emerged, mass displacement, regional destabilization, and political chaos, they revealed the hidden costs of prolonged shadow warfare. In the Middle East, the agency confronted shifting alliances shaped by ancient rivalries, oil politics, and rising nationalism. Support for certain leaders aimed to maintain regional stability, but the political transformations of the era proved too complex for any single power to control. Revolutions erupted, alliances fractured, and U.S. influence became entangled in local resentments. Intelligence successes often secured short-term objectives while leaving long-term volatility unresolved. Covert actions designed to prevent Soviet influence sometimes fueled anti-American sentiment, creating cycles of reaction that hardened regional divides. Africa presented another set of challenges. Newly independent nations sought paths free from external domination, but their fragility, rooted in borders drawn by colonial powers and economies built for extraction, made them susceptible to external leverage. The CIA worked to prevent Soviet and Chinese influence from solidifying across the continent, supporting political figures who could guarantee alignment with Western interests. But in nations where internal divisions ran deep, external backing often intensified power struggles. Leaders propped up for strategic reasons faced internal backlash. Opposition groups labeled as potential communist fronts sometimes represented genuine grassroots movements seeking reform. And through it all, the agency extended its reach into regions few American institutions understood in depth. Latin America remained a landscape of perennial tension. Here, the agency's actions intertwined most visibly with corporate interests, military elites, and political ideologies rooted in decades of inequality. The fear of leftist movements, whether moderate or radical, drove the U.S. to support coups, influence elections, and sustain intelligence relationships with regimes accused of widespread repression. These operations preserved certain strategic advantages, but at a profound moral cost. For many communities, American involvement became synonymous with suppression rather than support. Across all these regions, one theme persisted: the belief that hidden action could carve predictable outcomes from unpredictable realities. It was a belief sustained by genuine intelligence achievements, but also clouded by institutional momentum and ideological certainty. Each intervention seemed urgent, necessary, unavoidable. But together, they formed a pattern, one in which the agency had become simultaneously powerful and constrained, effective and overextended, visionary and blind. The world was now entering an era of multiplying conflicts, accelerating technological change, and rising internal dissent. In this tightening pressure, the CIA's actions would generate debates not just about strategy, but about identity, morality, and the boundaries of a democracy governing a global secret network. The shadows were no longer merely a tool, they were becoming a dilemma. The deeper the CIA ventured into the world's geopolitical fractures, the more its actions accumulated weight: economic weight, political weight, moral weight. What had once seemed like a series of isolated operations, each justified by the urgency of the Cold War, began to intertwine into a vast web of influence and consequence. And as the decades moved forward, this web tightened around nations, communities, and individuals whose lives were shaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, by decisions made thousands of miles away, under fluorescent lights, far removed from the ground-level realities they sought to engineer. Economically, the agency's interventions often aligned with broader American strategic goals: securing resource access, ensuring global market stability, shaping monetary policies in fragile economies. But these goals did not exist in a vacuum. In countries where agricultural land remained concentrated in the hands of a few, where industrialization lagged behind population growth, where colonial legacies carved deep inequalities into the soil, economic interventions carried profound consequences. Support for regimes that promised predictability often meant support for elites whose wealth depended on keeping the majority in states of perpetual scarcity. In nations like Guatemala, economic interests of foreign corporations shaped covert decisions that would ripple outward for generations. Intelligence operations justified as anti-communist frequently aligned neatly with the preservation of economic structures favoring American companies. And while officials insisted the intention was stability, the lived experience for millions was stagnation or upheaval. Racial and ethnic tensions formed another layer of complexity. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the agency operated in societies whose internal divisions predated colonialism, yet were intensified by it. Covert alliances sometimes relied on specific tribal, ethnic, or religious groups chosen for their political utility. But in such fragile contexts, empowering one group often meant marginalizing another. Decisions made in pursuit of geopolitical advantage amplified long-standing historical grievances. In some cases, intelligence support for particular factions changed political hierarchies that had existed for centuries. In others, covert funding pushed rival groups into direct conflict. The CIA did not create these tensions, but its interventions often intensified them, adding layers of modern geopolitical pressure to ancient fractures. Scientific and medical conflicts emerged as the Cold War took on new dimensions. Both superpowers scrambled to secure technological superiority: nuclear, chemical, biological. Intelligence gathering focused not only on weapons development, but on scientific communities, research institutions, and medical facilities. The agency sought to understand the Soviets' capabilities while protecting American programs from espionage. But scientific secrecy came with its own moral dilemmas. Intelligence related to human experimentation, biological agents, psychological manipulation, and interrogation methods opened a door the world was not prepared to look through. Programs conducted under the belief that national survival required extreme measures blurred ethical boundaries. And when later revealed, these programs left deep scars, not only on individuals directly affected, but on the agency's credibility. Political manipulation became the most visible form of conflict. The CIA worked to keep governments aligned with Western interests, sometimes through subtle influence, sometimes through overt engineering. Elections were monitored, influenced, or undermined. Leaders deemed unreliable were pressured, isolated, or replaced. Opposition groups were funded or dismantled, depending on their alignment with American strategy. In some countries, political manipulation brought temporary stability. In others, it fueled cycles of repression and revolt. The line between safeguarding national security and imposing foreign will grew increasingly difficult to discern. Media propaganda formed a quiet yet potent layer of the conflict. The agency recognized early that narratives shaped perceptions, and perceptions shaped political outcomes. It used newspapers, radio broadcasts, cultural institutions, and later television networks to mold public sentiment. Journalists, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unwittingly, became instruments in the shaping of global narratives. Much of this work targeted Soviet influence, but in practice, These media operations shaped how entire populations interpreted global events. The tension between truth and strategic messaging grew sharper with each passing year, raising profound questions about the ethical boundaries of information warfare. The criminal underground added another dimension. In regions where the state was weak or corruption pervasive, the CIA engaged with networks that lived outside legal structures. Smugglers, militias, black market traders, and organized crime groups occasionally became partners of necessity. Some were used to move weapons or supplies. Others provided intelligence from regions unreachable through official channels. But relationships built in the shadows carried their own risks. Criminal networks often grew stronger through these alliances, expanding their reach long after the agency's presence faded. In some regions, the long-term consequences included surges in narcotics production, arms trafficking, and entrenched corruption. Finally, global geopolitical effects created the overarching frame. Each intervention, economic, political, cultural, or covert, reshaped the global balance of power in ways that neither the CIA nor policymakers could fully predict. The agency became an invisible actor in civil wars, revolutions, border disputes, and ideological struggles. Some of its actions deterred Soviet expansion or prevented coups that could have destabilized entire regions. Others fueled resentment, radicalization, and anti-American sentiment. In a world divided by superpowers, those consequences sometimes remained contained. But when the Cold War ended, the suppressed tensions re-emerged with unprecedented force, revealing that interventions once deemed necessary had left behind a landscape riddled with unresolved contradictions. Each of these 7 layers, economic, racial, scientific, political, media, criminal, and geopolitical, did not exist in isolation. They intertwined, amplified, and collided with one another, forming a complex system of shadow conflicts. The CIA stood at the center of these intersections, not always as the architect, but always as a presence, shaping, reacting, adapting, and sometimes provoking shifts in global directions. And as these pressures intensified, a new struggle began to emerge, not between nations or ideologies, but within the agency itself. The question was no longer how far the CIA could go, but how far it should go. The cost of operating in the shadows was mounting. The consequences of decisions made decades earlier were beginning to surface. And the moral foundation of American power was becoming harder to defend. The world was changing once again, and the shadows were changing with it. By the final decades of the 20th century, the weight of past interventions began to surface in ways that could no longer be contained. What had once been classified as strategic necessity echoed across societies as generational trauma. The shadow wars, long insulated from public scrutiny, finally collided with a world growing more connected, more vocal, and more unwilling to accept narratives crafted in silence. And the CIA, once operating behind a veil that rarely tore, found itself increasingly pulled into the light. Lingering injustice formed the first and most painful layer of this reckoning. Communities in Latin America still lived with the consequences of coups that had reshaped their nations. Families torn apart during periods of political repression traced their grief back to years when foreign influence had quietly shaped national destinies. In Southeast Asia, survivors of conflicts carried scars, physical and emotional, from wars that had been expanded or prolonged by covert calculations. In Africa and the Middle East, borders drawn by colonial powers had collided with Cold War pressures, creating states whose instability could never be solved through clandestine intervention alone. For many of these communities, the question was not academic. Why did external powers have the authority to decide their fate? Why were their struggles interpreted through ideological frameworks imposed by distant governments? Why were decisions about their lives made in rooms they would never enter? Modern contradictions began to harden around these questions. The United States publicly championed democracy, yet supported authoritarian regimes when they aligned with strategic interests. It spoke of freedom while engaging in covert actions that limited the political agency of foreign populations. It condemned interference from rival powers, even while organizing interventions of its own. And as more of these contradictions became public, through investigations, leaks, and testimonies, the American public faced its own moral dilemma. How could a nation defined by ideals reconcile with an intelligence apparatus shaped by necessity rather than principle? Politically, the legacy of covert action reshaped entire regions. Some governments maintained stability through intelligence and military structures originally supported or trained by the CIA. Others struggled with cycles of corruption and fragmentation rooted in decades of intervention. In certain countries, anti-American sentiment took deep root, not because of propaganda, but because lived experience had made it difficult to separate U.S. values from U.S. actions. The long arc of covert influence often bent toward unintended consequences: revolutions that ousted U.S.-backed leaders, new regimes that embraced anti-Western ideologies, movements that reinterpreted past foreign interference as proof of external domination. Economically, the effects were equally complex. Nations whose leadership had been shaped through covert influence sometimes pursued economic models aligned with Western markets, but disconnected from local needs. Foreign corporations continued to exert pressure on natural resources and labor structures, deepening inequalities that fueled resentment. Global financial institutions, influenced by geopolitical considerations, imposed reforms that benefited global markets while destabilizing local livelihoods. And yet, in other cases, U.S. intelligence assistance had helped prevent economic collapse, or thwarted regimes that would have pursued catastrophic policies. Families and communities bore the deepest wounds. Disappearances, repression, civil wars, and insurgencies rooted in Cold War maneuvers left scars that passed from one generation to the next. In some cases, truth commissions attempted to unravel decades of secrecy, but the full story remained obscured, partly by destroyed documents, partly by the enormous complexity of disentangling local dynamics from foreign influence. Trauma became a silent inheritance. In countries like Chile, Iran, Guatemala, Angola, Laos, and Afghanistan, memories of intervention shaped national identities long after the Cold War ended. Science and propaganda clashed in the modern era with unprecedented intensity. The rise of the internet fractured the information landscape. The old model, covertly supporting media outlets or shaping cultural messaging, became more difficult to maintain. Narratives were now contested in real time by millions of people with access to global networks. Intelligence agencies could still gather data, but they could no longer reliably control perception. The result was a landscape of competing truths, where conspiracy theories blended with legitimate critiques, and where trust in institutions eroded across the world. Corporate power added another complication. Technology companies, once tools of intelligence gathering, became geopolitical actors in their own right. Data became the new currency of global influence, and private firms accumulated information once accessible only to governments. Intelligence operations intersected with corporate interests in ways lawmakers struggled to regulate. And as digital surveillance expanded, the line between national security and civilian privacy blurred at alarming speed. Internationally, the end of the Cold War did not produce stability. Instead, it unleashed forces long held in check by bipolar rivalry. Civil wars erupted in the Balkans and Africa. New terrorist networks emerged in the vacuum left by collapsing regimes. Rogue states pursued nuclear ambitions. The geopolitical order that replaced the Cold War was less predictable, less constrained, and far more decentralized. The CIA adapted, but in doing so, faced moral dilemmas more tangled than anything encountered in earlier decades. Counterterrorism became a dominant mission. The attacks of September 11th reshaped the agency's priorities overnight, leading to partnerships with governments accused of human rights abuses, expanded surveillance powers, and programs that blurred the boundaries of legality. Drone warfare, targeted killings, and enhanced interrogation sparked fierce global debates. Supporters argued these measures saved lives and prevented catastrophic attacks. Critics warned they deepened cycles of violence and compromised fundamental values. Global landscapes shifted once more. Rising powers challenged U.S. dominance. Cyber warfare replaced traditional espionage. Disinformation campaigns destabilized democracies from within. And through it all, the CIA navigated a world where shadows had multiplied, where threats emerged not from superpower confrontation, but from fragmented networks, fractured states, and unpredictable actors. The future crossroads now stands in stark relief. Nations must decide whether intelligence agencies should expand their tools or be constrained by new legal and ethical boundaries. Democracies must confront the paradox of needing secrecy while demanding transparency. And the world must grapple with a lesson history has taught repeatedly. Influence wielded without accountability eventually reshapes both the world and the wielder. The consequences of the Shadow Wars have not ended. They have only changed form. In the quiet tension of the early 21st century, as nations confront crises shaped by decades of hidden maneuvers, a new kind of reflection begins to take root. It is not a reflection rooted in accusation, nor in absolution, but in recognition. A recognition that the world built through Shadow Wars cannot simply be judged by victories or failures. It must be understood through the human cost, the moral weight, and the unresolved questions that now linger across continents like faint echoes of choices made in protected rooms. For all its reach, the CIA was never omnipotent. It did not control every outcome, nor predict every consequence. It operated in ambiguity, making decisions under immense pressure, often with incomplete information. And yet, its presence altered political ecosystems in ways that shaped global memory. To understand the modern world requires grappling with the uncomfortable truth that intelligence agencies, by design, operate at the boundary where morality and necessity collide. Their actions may aim to prevent catastrophe, but in doing so, they often carry within them the seeds of future turmoil. The moral responsibility of such an institution cannot be measured solely by outcomes. It must be judged by the honesty with which its legacy is confronted. Across the world, communities demand not vengeance, but acknowledgement, an admission that their histories were entangled in a struggle larger than themselves, that their suffering was not an accident of fate, but part of a chain of geopolitical decisions. Recognition does not rewrite the past, but it offers a foundation for trust, a way to break the cycle of secrecy that feeds suspicion and resentment. As global tensions shift, the philosophical questions become sharper. What is the nature of security in a world where threats emerge not from superpowers, but from fractured networks and digital shadows? What does sovereignty mean when foreign influence can be exerted through cyber operations, economic pressure, or narrative manipulation rather than armies? And how should democracies balance openness with the need to protect information crucial to national survival? These questions strain the boundaries of political theory, stretching beyond traditional frameworks of justice or governance. They demand a new kind of ethical imagination. The modern intelligence apparatus sits at a crossroads, not because its mission has ended, but because the world around it has transformed. Power no longer flows only through territory or ideology. It flows through data, perception, and technology moving faster than law or morality can adjust. In this shifting reality, every nation must confront an unsettling possibility. The very tools that once defended stability can become sources of instability if left unchecked. Secrecy, once a shield, can erode public trust when misused. Intervention, once justified as prevention, can fuel new waves of resentment. Surveillance, once a means of protection, can become a force of quiet domination, if not constrained by democratic oversight. Yet it is too simple to imagine a world without intelligence agencies. The threats that define our era, cyber sabotage, extremist networks, nuclear proliferation, disinformation campaigns, emerging technologies with catastrophic potential, cannot be met with diplomacy alone. Information is still the lifeblood of security. Understanding adversaries remains essential. Anticipating crises before they erupt remains the difference between peace and catastrophe. The question is not whether intelligence agencies should exist, but how they should evolve. The future demands not dismantling, but reimagining, a shift toward transparency where possible and secrecy only where necessary, a commitment to ethical boundaries that reflect not only national laws, but global moral standards, collaboration with international partners not to impose outcomes, but to prevent the kind of destabilization that Shadow Wars once fueled. Intelligence work grounded not in ideological fear, but in a sober recognition of global interdependence. Still, even as new frameworks emerge, the past cannot simply be sealed behind archival doors. The shadows remain part of the world's moral landscape. They remind us that power, once exercised without visibility, leaves marks that outlast intentions. They warn us that the pursuit of security must not erode the values it claims to defend. And they challenge future generations to understand secrecy not as a realm beyond ethics, but as a domain where ethics must operate with even greater precision. In the end, the story of the CIA's Shadow Wars is not a story of heroes or villains. It is the story of a world navigating fear, ambition, uncertainty, and the relentless drive to shape history before history shapes us. It is a story built from choices made in the belief that the stakes justified the means, a belief that carried both wisdom and tragedy. And now, as the world stands at a threshold defined by technologies and crises unimaginable to the Cold War architects, one final truth emerges with clarity. The greatest danger is not the existence of shadows, but the refusal to understand what they contain. For history is illuminated not by the light that exposes, nor by the darkness that conceals, but by the moral courage to face what lies between.